Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Innovation Conversation. Today we are joined by Dr. Jeff Standridge. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Jeff, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. Jeff Standridge. I am an innovation consultant and executive coach, growth strategist. I do several different things, but I started my career in healthcare, spent about a dozen years in healthcare, and then moved over to the business world. Spent 20 years with a publicly traded company, uh, uh, running global operations, doing mergers and acquisitions. So I tell people that I became an entrepreneur from the world of being an entrepreneur, and I became an innovator from the world of being a corporate change agent. So spent quite a bit of time in Europe. I got to visit Lisbon a time or two. So about 8 years ago, I left my corporate employment to start our consultancy called the Innovation Junkies, and then an entrepreneurial support organization called the Conductor. So I work both with startup companies and entrepreneurs all the way up to mid-market and large organizations as well. Great to be here.
Fascinating. I mean, this is actually, I have so many questions right now. It's going to be absolutely crazy. Oh, and I was actually checking something on your profile. You're also a pilot, which is pretty cool.
I am. Yeah. Fairly recently. So I started flying about 3 years ago and ended up doing multiple certificates. So my private pilot, my instrument rating, my multi-engine rating. And so it sure has made getting around to clients a lot easier and a lot less hassle.
I can imagine. Yeah. I'm actually quite curious because you started obviously in the corporate world and then you move over to the more entrepreneurial and startup type of world. You probably know what works and what doesn't work. So just to get, this kind of started, are you able to pinpoint exactly if a company or startup is going to be successful from the get-go or not at all?
Not at all. I mean, there are criteria that we look at, I'm also an investor. And so I get the opportunity to review a lot of companies on a weekly, monthly, annual basis. There are things that we look at. Clearly, we're going to look at the value proposition of the company, the uniqueness of what they're trying to do. We're going to put a lot of focus on the management team, just the leadership that they bring to the table. Have they done it before? But I'd be lying if I said that that anybody could pick a winner from the get-go.
Interesting. And, from your time in Europe, and obviously you're from the US, do you find the mentality of people is actually quite different when it comes to running a business? Is there like a lot of cultural shocks and stuff like that? And especially, is there a different attitude to running a business in Europe versus the US, or not at all?
Yeah, I would say they're different cultural attitudes. I don't know if it's different specifically in running a business, but there's a little bit of a difference in how we view corporate culture, how we view leadership, how we view communication. I was talking to on a podcast with a gentleman from the UK the other day, and he said when he was working with US-based companies, he said, "You're always so positive and enthusiastic from the US," and I believe that is the case. I said to him, we're still relatively a young country relative to the countries in Europe and around the world. We're 250 years in, and so we tout ourselves as the land of opportunity, and so we see immigrants that come in from all around the world, and they're able to create successful, thriving empires. And so yeah, I believe there is a little bit of a difference. But at the end of the day, we all have the levers and knobs and dials that we all use the same ones to fine tune how a business operates.
Interesting. I'm always curious because every single person I talk to here in UK and in Europe, they are always obsessed with going to the US overall. They say, "Oh, US is where everything's happening. We need to move to the US." But then when you actually talk with someone from the US, they say, "Well, actually, there's quite a lot of stuff happening in Europe as well, so you don't necessarily need to move to the US to make that happen." I'm curious on something else, which is in terms of the funding rounds and the size of the funding rounds. Have you noticed them to be completely different, or quite on the contrary, it's actually pretty much the same size?
You mean between the US and say Europe?
Yeah.
No, I haven't seen a significant difference between kind of the US as a whole. And what I would say is the primary areas where capital rounds originate in the U.S. The expected places like Silicon Valley, Boston, New York, et cetera. I wouldn't see a big difference there between there and the rounds you see coming from Europe or Israel or any other location. What I do see is a significant difference in the U.S. between the places where people commonly think of being venture capital heavy versus what I would describe as middle America, where I'm located. Valuations tend to be considerably different on the coasts, much higher on the coast than say in the heartland, is what we kind of call the flyover states. So in fact, our investment fund, Cadron Capital Partners, we're predominantly looking at opportunities in the heartland of the United States for that very reason. So I don't see a big difference globally, but I do see within geographies what we would call unexpected places where startups originate, that the valuations are quite a bit different.
Interesting. What do you look for in startup when they're just raising? I don't know which stage you normally invest in, but I'm curious, like pre-seed and seed. What are your criteria for them?
So our specific criteria are if it's a SaaS company, and we're a little later stage now. We don't do as much pre-seed and seed stage stuff as we used to do. When we were looking at it at that time, it was the quality of the idea, the quality of the vetting of the idea with customer discovery, and the quality of the management team. We're a little bit later stage. We're kind of Series A or just pre-Series A, kind of Series A gap rounds or what have you. And we look at if it's a SaaS company or a subscription-based software, we're looking at $2 million of annual recognized or annual recurring run rate. If it's a non-SaaS product or service, probably more like $3.5 to $4 million. We're looking at high gross margins. We're looking at an experienced leadership team who's done it before. Those are kind of the criteria that we're looking at, and we're pretty much industry agnostic.
Okay, that's pretty cool, because then you open up the doors for a lot of stuff, right? So it just makes
Sure.
it that much more interesting. Now, I am curious on something else, which is you actually have a published book. How many books have you written so far? Is it 3?
I actually have 4.
4? Okay.
Yep. 3 most recently. So I have 3 that have been done since I've been in the work that I'm doing today. I have one called the Innovators Field Guide, which looks something like this. It says accelerators for entrepreneurs, innovators, and change agents. I have another one called the Top Performers Field Guide. Some of my academic research was focused on identifying top performers and looking at the criteria that are the characteristics of top performers. And then my business partner, Jeff Amarian, and I, another Jeff, by the way, we have a book that came out in 2021 called Creating Startup Junkies, Building Sustainable Venture Ecosystems in Unexpected Places. So it's a book that focuses on how to create a culture, how to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem, an entrepreneurial culture, how to cultivate talent, access to capital, and community engagement around building thriving entrepreneurial ecosystems.
Wow, there's quite a lot of information to take in there, and lots of knowledge. I'm curious on one thing: the top performers, right? Because we all kind of know who they are, but are you able to pinpoint and say this is what all the top performers do on a consistent basis?
So that's really where,
Yeah.
that's really where my research focused on when I was working on my doctorate in healthcare to start, but then in the corporate environment following. You say we all know who they are, but the interesting thing about it is when I moved over to Axiom Corporation, which was a publicly traded company at the time, and I started by having all the employees in the company and all of the management and leadership of the company nominate high performers from the company. And when we got the list and looked at it, it was about 80% different. Who the top performers that employees said were top performers were vastly different than the top performers that management and leadership said. So when we looked at the list, so that was a problematic finding there, is that what people believe top performance is, or what people believe the characteristics of top performance is different from employees to leadership, right?
Yeah.
So we were able to find about 30 to 50 individuals that were across both organization or both nomination lists. Then we were able to validate it with some of their actual performance metrics in the organization. I think we identified ultimately about 30 or 35, and then we started interviewing them around instances where they were challenged, but they ended up being successful, instances where they thought they were staring failure in the face, but they ended up being successful. We looked at their behaviors, we looked at their decisions, we looked at all of those things. One thing that we know for sure is that academic performance does not correlate with high performance. Academic credentials do not correlate with high performance. It really boils down to behavior. The knowledge, skills, and abilities that I have that enable me to develop specific habits and behaviors around results generation and relationship management. So results and relationships. If I focus on results at the expense of relationships, I will achieve success very, very quickly, but I won't be able to maintain those results after I alienate everyone around me who's responsible for helping me maintain those results. By the same token, if I focus on relationships at the expense of results, people will love me for a while until they lose respect for me because I can't deliver results, and then I lose them both. And so there are specific knowledge, skills, and abilities that enable me to develop behaviors and habits around results generation and behaviors and habits around relationship creation and management and maintenance. And I have to balance those sets of behaviors to be successful ultimately.
Interesting. And is this across both the entrepreneurial world and the corporate world? So you see
It really
this
is.
as interesting.
So since doing that research in the U.S., I've had the opportunity to kind of what I would call do observational research, anecdotal and observational research across 5 continents over the last 25 years. And I have seen that play out in every setting, in nonprofits, in individual success, in leadership success, in for-profit organizations, in publicly traded organizations, in startup companies. It's pretty much a universal.
Interesting. And is there, obviously, I'm assuming you also do the training for people who want to get better at all these things. But is there, how should I put this, is there any specific training someone can do to be better at both building relationships, but also delivering on what they're supposed to deliver? Do you think that actually works for everyone?
Yeah, I don't know of any specific training program or training module. What I encourage people to do is to take an inventory, kind of a self-inventory of the strengths and weaknesses that they have. Just here are what I believe my strengths are, here are what I believe my weaknesses are, and then to do some validation with other people, asking for feedback, getting some unbiased feedback from people that we work with, from our significant others, from colleagues, friends, what have you. And then once we take that list and feel like we've got a pretty good exhaustive list of strengths and weaknesses, then begin to separate those out into results versus relationship oriented types of strengths and weaknesses, and then begin looking for ways to skills, capabilities, knowledge, what have you around those areas of weakness.
Interesting. And then you also wrote a book on startup ecosystems and startup junkies. So this is actually quite fascinating for me because obviously I have an opportunity to talk with multiple ecosystems across Europe. Have you found that it's actually quite hard to create your own ecosystem, or it's just a matter of going out there and asking a bunch of people, hey, would you like to come and run this with me? And then we just build something up from the ground up.
No, it is a marathon forced march versus a sprint. We've been doing it here in Arkansas for over 15 years. And, we think that there are 4 pillars that we tend to focus on. One is talent development, making sure that we're trying to build innovative entrepreneurial talent, because even large flagship employers want to hire innovative entrepreneurial people. But we also need that for startups and growing businesses, scaling businesses. So talent, creating a culture, an entrepreneurial culture where people can come together, can share ideas, can share resources, can participate in training together and networking events. The third element, or the third pillar, is community engagement, getting large institutions involved like the colleges and universities, large flagship employers involved, financial institutions, investors, getting all of those folks engaged in the ecosystem as well. And then finally, looking for ways to provide access to capital and to help help entrepreneurs navigate that access to capital at every stage of venture development. As you said earlier, from the pre-seed to seed stage to the Series A, the Series B, and all the way throughout that continuum. So those four elements is what we have found to really focusing on makes a difference over the longer term.
I'm curious on one thing. Now, we talk a lot about innovation and how important it is to be an innovator in, in multiple areas of your life. But as a manager, how do you manage someone who's a natural born innovator? Because I know for a fact that it's quite hard to be in the company and you're trying to manage someone who's always coming up with new ideas and new ways of doing things, and you just want them to execute. So how do you manage that? But at the same time, how do you create the space for new ideas to actually rise up and to be applied in multiple companies? How do you do that?
Well, first of all, I think we have to give people the flexibility to understand that failure's only failure if you quit. Otherwise, it's just feedback, right? So creating a culture where people understand that failure is part of the success formula.
Mhm.
And we like to talk about, fail faster and fail often. But what we do is we limit the degree of that failure by doing our research, by doing our customer discovery, by making certain that we understand what we're trying to do and the market impact of what we're trying to do before we mortgage our house to go make an investment on something that's half baked. So we do quite a lot of very, very specific work around what's the problem we're trying to solve, who are the target customers that experience that problem to the greatest degree, what's our unique value proposition to solve that problem, have we done customer discovery around all of those elements, product market fit, problem solution fit, that whole thing. So recognizing that failure is part of the success continuum, I think, is probably the key element to that. And then giving people a process
Mhm.
to limit the impact of those failures so that they can fail faster, fail often, and make improvements to their innovations, their ideas.
Putting on a different hat now as an investor, when you invest in a company and you see that they are failing fast, but learning the lessons and adapting to the challenges and overcoming those challenges, but still failing nevertheless, would you continue investing in a company, or do you just call it quits and say, guys, you failed too much, too many times? Like I'm done with you.
Yeah, I think it really depends. You know, it really depends on the nature of those failures, and
Mhm.
are those failures a result of just multiple oversights
Mhm.
or multiple situations where we didn't really assess the environment well, we didn't really do the work.
Mhm.
There's no shortcut to success in the startup world, and so we place a lot of focus on, are the entrepreneurs doing the work to actually take their company to ultimately a successful place? Are they pivoting based upon customer feedback? Are they pivoting based upon market dynamics? Or are they out
Mhm.
there not doing the work and shooting an arrow one direction, then shooting an arrow another direction, then shooting, and they're playing pin the tail on the donkey, so to speak.
I
If
think
that's the
really,
case, we're probably
yeah.
not going to continue throwing good money after bad. So it really depends on the situation.
I'm curious on something else, which is there's always everyone kind of talks that you need to go to Silicon Valley, you need to go, San Francisco, obviously being obviously almost the same place. Do you find in terms of human resources, you can actually find talent across the world and across America more specifically, or are they just focused on these regions? And that's actually a shame.
Well, that's the book you mentioned a few moments ago, Creating Startup Junkies. It's about creating startup junkies in unexpected places, which literally means outside of Silicon
Mhm.
Valley, outside of Boston, New York, what have you. So we have been focused on helping people understand that you can in fact build and find talent in these
Mhm.
unexpected places. So I absolutely challenge the assumption and the belief that you've got to go to Silicon Valley to build a good quality, healthy startup and find the talent that you need, that you can find the talent you need in these unexpected places. You take a look at two and a half, 3 hours north of me in Northwest Arkansas. We have the headquarters for three Fortune 100 companies: Walmart headquarters,
Yep.
Tyson Food headquarters, JB Hunt, which is one of the largest logistics companies in the world. in Arkansas, in Northwest Arkansas. We've got one of the largest coffee companies called West Rock Coffee just down the street here in one of their two major locations. We've got one of the largest data management and analytics companies just about 2 miles that way called Axiom Corporation, part of the Interpublic group. And so yeah, I absolutely challenge the assumption that you've got to go to Silicon Valley or that you have to go anywhere other than where you are.
What about the support of the local government in terms of like tax deductions and having lower taxes? How impactful is that overall?
Oh, it's hugely impactful. In fact, I spent about 7 years on the board of science and technology for the state of Arkansas, appointed by the governor. It's our economic development entity in the state of Arkansas is called the Arkansas Economic Development Commission. And the director of that is actually appointed by the governor. And they have a number of incentives there for research and development tax credits, equity investor tax credits. They actually have non-dilutive funding programs like what we call the Technology Development Program investment, which is a royalty-based investment, the Seed Capital Investment Program, and other types of incentives. In fact, one of the funding mechanisms that they have is they also fund a statewide technology commercialization center called ARISE, and ARISE is an acrostic that stands for Arkansas Innovators, Startups, and Entrepreneurs. And just recently, our team at the Conductor Startup Junkie was selected by the state of Arkansas to manage the state's technology commercialization center, funded by the state of Arkansas. So it is catalytic in all of those incentives. Non-dilutive funding programs and technology commercialization programs are catalytic at helping to spawn activity within the state of Arkansas. You know, what's the population of Lisbon roughly?
Oh, it's about 1 million. It's a small town. It's not that big.
Yeah. So what's the population of Portugal?
10 million in total.
10 million. All right. And
you
Portugal,
guys probably have the same in the state, I think. No.
So we have 3 million in the state of Arkansas, the entire state. Our geographic size is about the size of the UK, and our they have 70 million people and we have 3 million people.
Yeah.
So we're a very rural.
It's crazy.
Say again.
I'm saying the revenue generate as a group of people, it's actually quite high, isn't it? So that's quite important.
Yeah, for sure.
I was wondering, have you noticed that? Actually, I actually have two questions here, but the first one is, if there's this European startup, they want to move somewhere in the US, would you advise them obviously to, and I know you're going to be biased on this one and rightfully so, would you advise them to move to Arkansas and try and do business there and try and launch in Arkansas compared to, let's say, Delaware, where we know there's all this legislation that kind of helps companies?
Yeah, of course, I will try to advise them to move to Arkansas or a state or a place like Arkansas, because they're going to be a big fish in a small body of water versus a little fish in a very large body of water. And the focus that they're going to get with just a little bit of success, the focus they're going to get, the financial incentives they're going to get, the cost of living, the cost of labor, all of those things are going to be financially advantageous to them. Doesn't have to be Arkansas. Of course, I would try to recruit them to Arkansas. Doesn't have to be Arkansas, but it could be places in the flyover states, in the heartland, kind of that middle America, where there's a balance of metropolitan with rural, because the cost of getting their business off the ground is going to be so much less expensive.
Interesting. Because there's always conversations, and I talk with multiple companies, and they always have this dream of going to the US, doing business in the US. But I think they don't actually look at it as a place with so many states. They only look at 1 or 2 locations, and that's actually a shame, right? It's just an error from the get-go. And then they end up getting stuck and saying, oh, rent is really expensive in New York, or we can't afford an office in San Francisco. Oh, guys, look elsewhere. There's more states, and they probably offer a lot of incentives. So.
Yeah. They also don't understand the geographic breadth of the state of Arkansas. I lived in London for about 18 months when I was doing mergers and acquisitions, and we had some friends after we moved back from the UK, who said, "Yeah, hey, we're gonna be in the US for about 10 days, and we'd love to pop in and see you guys." And I said, "Okay, where are you going?" They said, "Well, we thought we would fly into New York, but then we're going to drive down to Miami and then maybe drive over to Los Angeles. And
Yeah.
so we thought we would pop in, and I was like, you're going to need way more than 10 days.
Yep.
You're gonna need 10 days just to do the drives, just to do the
Hmm.
drive, but you're not going to see anything. You're just going to be driving for 10 days. So
Yep.
they don't understand the breadth. And then they only think about, as you said, the New Yorks, the Miamis, the Chicagos, the San Franciscos, and there's a lot of other very thriving cities around the state, around the country rather, that are much less expensive and provide access to high quality talent, resources, capital, and what have you.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm curious on one thing, which is in Europe, there's always, I guess, in the last 6 months or so, there's been talks of a bit of a slowdown when it comes to investment. People are saying it's actually quite hard to raise money now because obviously the interest rates were quite high. Have you noticed the same thing in the US, or quite on the contrary, it's been,
No, yeah, we've seen the same thing. My experience is when the real estate market is hot and when the stock market is hot, it's
Mhm.
difficult to get people to make the higher risk venture type of investments because of the risk relative to the reward.
Yep.
Usually though, when you begin to see a cooling off of the stock market or a little more volatility in the real estate market or what have you, you see a little more cash coming into the venture spaces, as a result. And so yeah, I think we're seeing some of that same kind of thing globally, quite frankly.
I'm incredibly curious on one thing, which is you've published 4 books now. How hard is it to actually write a book and publish it? Obviously, a lot of people would use ChatGPT right now, and it'll come
Yeah.
out absolutely horrible. So, how hard is it to actually launch a book? I mean, that's quite impressive.
It's not hard to launch a book and get it out there. There's a lot of
Mhm.
resources where you can hire typesetters and editors and cover designers and those kinds of things. What's difficult for me is literally writing the book, process of planning the content, the making sure that you're not being redundant and repetitive, but that you fully cover the topic that you're wanting to cover, and that you give the reader actionable insights that they can use so that the book actually makes a difference. It's easy to just put a book together and throw it out there, but if you want to really have something that's impactful, that's thought provoking, that leaves someone better than you found them, so to speak, then it's quite a bit more difficult. But the mechanics are not difficult at all.
You've done so much. It's quite impressive even to be sitting here and talking with you. I always want to understand what actually goes on behind the scenes, and I always try and ask this question, which is when you're having a bad day, when you're having one of those days where you just want to give up, what thoughts go through your mind? What's the one thing that keeps on popping by? Is it just fate? Is this that a complete craziness? Is like high confidence? What is it? What goes through your mind when you're having a really bad day and tough moment?
It's interesting. I don't know that I have really bad days. And I'm not, I mean bad things happen,
Yeah.
bad things happen, but I think bad days are between our ears.
Hmm.
I think that the biggest battle we will ever wage, in many instances, the biggest war that we will ever wage, is the one that goes on between our ears, and allowing thoughts to conquer our psyche, to allow thoughts to conquer our attitude, to allow our feelings to lie to us and get us
Hmm.
to behave in ways that we know we shouldn't behave. So I'm very much a proponent of mental toughness, mental resilience, and being able to control our emotions, not stuff them down, but just control them. So I don't know that I ever really have a really, really bad day. I have bad things that happen, but just like failure's only failure if you quit in a business,
Hmm.
setbacks are temporary. Bad things that happen are only temporary. Someone asked me one time, actually shared with me, when they find themselves being consumed with worry, they ask themselves just a handful of questions. Number one, what's the absolute worst thing that can happen? If that about which you're worrying comes to fruition, if it actually occurs, what's the worst thing that can happen? And then once you identify that worst thing, then ask yourself the question, well, if that worst thing happens, can I live with it? And the vast majority of the time, the answer is yes. There was some research that was done a while back that said that actually only about, I think it was about 85% of the time, everything that we worry about, the things that we worry about never even come to fruition. 85% of the time, it never happens.
Yeah.
Of the remaining 15% of the time, 12% of the time, that which we're worrying about comes to fruition, but it's less than or even better than it's better than what we anticipated. And sometimes it's an even positive outcome, not a negative outcome, which means that the remaining 3% of the time, that about which we're worrying comes to fruition, and it's bad. It's as bad as what we anticipated. So worry is kind of a liar. It's kind of a liar, and recognizing those statistics, I think, is probably what's helped me navigate. If something bad happens, then I immediately go into, okay, this has happened. What I need to do to lessen the impact on my business, on my family, on my life, on my time, what have you.
Interesting. Now, this was a lessons for business and also for pilots. And I'm just about to ask you something to do with, I love aviation. I actually have a background in aviation as well. But I'm curious on one thing, which is time management. How do you manage to do all these things? It's quite impressive. I'm assuming quite a lot of time consuming activities as well. So how do you manage all that?
Well, number one, I am in tune just over the last 15 or 20 years with what I believe my God-given calling is, my purpose in life. And I believe that I've received specific gifts to create new insights that inspire people to better ways of living and working. And so much of what I do around Innovation Junkie, Conductor, writing books, speaking on leadership, doing podcasts, investing in companies is about fulfilling that purpose, fulfilling that calling of creating new insights that lead people to better ways of living and working. So I'd say that is first and foremost, that I get energized. And so the second thing is that I don't have hobbies that take me away for hours and hours and hours at a time, like fishing or golf. I play golf occasionally, but it's not an every Saturday morning 6-hour hobby. My hobby is much of my hobbies outside of being with my family, which is my biggest hobby. My hobbies have to do with thinking about better ways to fulfill my purpose. And so I've constantly got an iPad in my lap, or I'm constantly consuming a podcast or an ebook, an audio book, or something. And so I feel like living this integrated lifestyle. I'm working way harder than what I expected to be working at 58 years of age, but I'm having a great time doing it. So as long as I continue having a great time doing it, I'm going to keep doing it.
Sounds like the dream. I'm curious on one thing. I mean, we were talking before that you actually fly to things now instead of, well, most people fly to things, but you actually fly on your own plane instead of going commercial.
Yeah.
That must be amazing, though. How does that even work?
Well, it is. I had a client meeting in Chicago a few weeks ago, and I was going to fly myself, but the weather wasn't looking great, and it was going to be too iffy with the weather, and so I ended up flying commercial. And so it was a direct flight, which there's not a lot of direct flights out of Arkansas, but it was a direct flight. We left on time. We arrived early. My Uber got there very quickly and took me to my hotel. Coming home, we left on time. We got home early, and I still hated it. It was still terrible. Have to be at the airport. I leave my home 2 hours before my flight so that I can get to the airport, get through security, get to the gate. Many times we have to fly through Dallas or Chicago or Atlanta to go somewhere else because there aren't really close connections like there are in Europe, or direct connections rather. And so, but when I fly myself, I drive 10 minutes to a different airport. I get on my plane, and I leave, and I'm there in, a couple of hours. And so, yeah, it's just, it makes a big difference. It's enabled me to be able to see more clients in a shorter period of time than I would do otherwise, to get more work done in fewer days. If I go to Chicago, I can do an early morning flight and come home late at night. But almost always, if I go anywhere commercially, it's going to be an overnight flight. Where here I can be I can be in Chicago in 2.5 hours. I can be in Dallas in an hour and 45 minutes. I can be in Nashville in 2 hours. I can be down to the beach on the Gulf Coast in 2 hours. So there's a pretty broad brush of places that I can go to work with clients in a couple of hours.
Do you ever have like meetings inside the plane? Do you ever take people over for let's go over and fly over, I don't know, some city and just go over and talk with people? Did that ever happen?
No, I really don't do that. I mean, now granted, when I'm flying some of my business partners, they may be in the back talking business, and we may all be talking business through the headsets. But
Yeah.
usually, when I'm flying, I'm focused on
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's actually one of the first rules, isn't it? First
yeah,
you aviate, then you is it aviate, navigate, and
aviate,
communicate?
navigate, communicate. Yeah.
Okay, I got them right. I was like, they got the order right, but yeah, okay, that's quite impressive, Jeff. I'm sure a lot of people after listening to this podcast and seeing the podcast, they want to see obviously your own podcast, which we're going to add to the link, but they probably also want to reach out to you. Now we have 4 books on Amazon people can buy, which is awesome. How can they reach out to you? What's a better way of doing that?
Yeah, the best way to reach out to me, probably 2 or 3 different ways. The best one is probably LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and it's Jeff Standridge is my handle on LinkedIn. Jeff S, as is Jeff Standridge, Jeff S at innovationjunkie.com and jeffstandridge.com. Have my own website as well. So happy to connect, and would love to talk with any of your listeners who would want to connect with me.
Sounds good, Jeff. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It has been my pleasure. I appreciate you for having me, and I hope you survive the heat.
I shall. Thank you so much.